The lantern's glow flickered against the wooden beams of the old saloon, throwing long shadows that danced across the smoke-thickened air. Outside, the night pressed heavy, filled with the muffled shuffle of boots on dirt and the restless snort of horses waiting in the dark. Inside, every eye was fixed on the table at the center. Cassian Holt sat there, shoulders squared, his weathered hat pulled low. Across from him, a stranger, Silvan Roarke, pushed a glass of amber whiskey across the scarred wood. It wasn't just a drink. It was a challenge. Cassian's hand hovered above the glass, the silence in the room stretching like a rope about to snap. The crowd around them had gone stone still, their poker games forgotten, their voices silenced. Even the old upright piano in the corner seemed to hold its breath. The moment his fingers brushed the rim of the glass, a creak echoed as someone shifted nervously on a chair, but no one dared break the tension. Cassian lifted the whiskey, his gaze never leaving Silvan's. He drank. The burn of the liquor seared down his throat, but the heat in his chest was nothing compared to the cold that settled over the room. Eleanor Hargrove, standing by the wall with her arms crossed, narrowed her eyes. She had seen this kind of thing before, the quiet start of something bloody. Behind her, Reuben Pike, jittery as ever, tapped his fingers against his revolver's grip. The saloon's owner, Sam Cutter, wiped his hands on his apron but stayed well away, his face pale as moonlight. Cassian set the glass down slow, the sound of it touching wood sharp as a gunshot. The stranger's lips curved into a thin smile, the kind that said he already knew the ending to this story. Outside, faint hoofbeats echoed closer, steady and deliberate, like drums of war approaching. Jedediah Boone, old rancher hunched at the bar, muttered a curse under his breath. He recognized the sound, and he knew trouble wasn't coming. Trouble was already here. A bead of sweat slid down Cassian's temple, though his expression remained stone. The room smelled of whiskey, sweat, and fear. He flexed his scarred knuckles against the table's edge, the wood groaning under the strain. The silence had become unbearable, every man and woman in that saloon waiting for someone else to flinch. Cassian's eyes darkened as he leaned forward just an inch, enough to show he was ready. And that's when he realized, they hadn't come for the cattle. They'd come for him. The sun rose over Greystone Ridge like molten fire, casting long shadows across the dry plains. Cassian Holt had been awake since dawn, his back bent against the rough fence post he was mending. The leather of his gloves was cracked, the hammer in his hand steady despite years of calluses carved into his palms. The morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, the kind of smell that never left a man's clothes. His ranch wasn't much, just a scatter of cattle, a barn that leaned in the wind, and the silence of land that was his alone. For Cassian, silence was more trustworthy than people. He wiped sweat from his brow and leaned on the fence, watching a hawk circle overhead. That quiet moment was broken by the sound of hooves clattering down the dirt road. A wagon rattled into view, driven by Jedediah Boone, the old rancher who had been Cassian's nearest neighbor since anyone could remember. Beside him sat his daughter, Clara, her hair tied back under a worn bonnet. She lifted a hand in greeting, her smile small but genuine. Boone reined the horses in front of the gate. "Morning, Holt," he called. "Heard talk in town. Stranger's been asking your name." Cassian's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, just pressed the nails deeper into the wood as if silence might hammer the rumor away. Clara's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and curious, though she said nothing. Finally, Cassian muttered, "Strangers ask a lot of things." Boone grunted, uneasy. "These ones don't ask for directions. They're sniffin' for blood." The words hung heavy, too heavy for the calm of morning. Later that day, Cassian rode into town for supplies. The streets of Greystone were alive with noise, children chasing one another, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, merchants shouting their prices. Yet beneath it all, something was off. He could feel it in the way conversations hushed as he passed, in the wary glances that followed him. Sam Cutter, standing in the doorway of his saloon, gave a nod that looked more like a warning than a welcome. Across the street, Marshal Vernon Tate leaned against a post, chewing on a straw, eyes fixed on Cassian as if measuring him for a grave. Cassian hitched his horse outside the general store, but before he stepped inside, a voice called out. It was Eleanor Hargrove, leaning in the shade of the church steps, her shawl pulled tight despite the heat. "Be careful where you step, Holt," she said softly, almost like a prayer. Sometimes the ground gives way when you least expect it. Cassian studied her, searching for meaning in her words, but she only turned and disappeared inside. He stood there, unsettled, the echo of her warning clinging to him like dust in the wind. Something was wrong in Greystone, and though he couldn't yet see its shape, he felt it pressing close. A storm was gathering, and he was standing dead center in its path. That night, the wind howled across the plains like a restless spirit, rattling the loose boards of Cassian Holt's barn. He sat at the small wooden table inside his cabin, a kerosene lamp casting a weak circle of light over a deck of worn playing cards he wasn't really playing. His thoughts replayed Eleanor Hargrove's warning, Boone's unease, and the stares that had followed him through Greystone streets. Something was closing in, and the silence outside only made it louder. A sudden knock at the door broke the quiet. Cassian's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. When he opened the door, Clara Boone stood there, her face pale, her bonnet slipping from her head. "They're watching us," she whispered. "Men I've never seen before, hanging near the creek by our ranch. My father says to keep out of it, but I know they're looking for you." Her voice trembled, but her eyes carried more courage than fear. She wanted him to act, even if Boone had told him to stay clear. Cassian led her inside, setting the lamp closer so he could see her face. "Why come to me?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then said, "Because Pa's too old to fight, and Marshal Tate won't lift a finger unless someone lines his pockets. If trouble's heading our way, you're the only one who might stand against it." Her words landed heavy, stirring something Cassian had buried long ago, the part of him that once fought for others, and paid dearly for it. He walked to the window, staring out at the vast darkness of the plains. Every choice had its cost. If he ignored Clara, the Boones might face whatever was coming alone and blood would spill. If he stepped in, he'd be putting his own life and land in the crosshairs. His fists clenched at his sides. He had come to Greystone to escape that kind of fight, to live quietly, to forget. But the West didn't forget. It dragged a man back into the fire whether he was ready or not. As if fate wanted to tip the scales, a low whistle cut through the night air outside the cabin, sharp, deliberate, and far too close. Cassian moved fast, dousing the lamp and pulling Clara behind the heavy oak table. Through the crack in the shutter, he saw shadows moving near the fence line. Whoever they weren't lost travelers. They were scouts, testing the edges, waiting to see if he'd react. When the night grew still again, Clara's breath shaky beside him, Cassian knew the truth. He had no choice anymore. Tomorrow, he would have to decide, walk away and let Greystone rot, or stand his ground and fight the storm that was already on his doorstep. And if he chose the latter, there would be no turning back. Morning broke with a crimson sky, the kind that made old ranchers mutter about omens. Cassian Holt saddled his horse in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The memory of shadows near his fence still gnawed at him. He had chosen, though he hadn't spoken it aloud, if trouble was coming, he would meet it head-on. Clara Boone had gone home under cover of night, but her words lingered like a thorn, "You're the only one who might stand against it." When Cassian rode into Greystone, the town felt different. There was a hum in the air, a low current of unease. Men stood in tight circles outside the mercantile, their voices hushed. At the saloon, Sam Cutter was sweeping the porch with more force than needed, his eyes darting down the street like he expected a storm to roll in any second. And in the distance, Cassian caught sight of riders, 3 of them, sitting idle near the edge of town. Their dusters were long, their hats pulled low, faces unreadable. They weren't here for business, they were waiting. Inside the saloon, the air smelled of stale beer and sweat. Eleanor Hargrove sat in the corner, her shawl draped around her shoulders, watching everything with quiet intensity. When Cassian entered, she raised her chin slightly, as if to confirm she'd been expecting him. Before he could speak, Reuben Pike staggered in, his voice slurred with drink. "Outsiders," he spat, pointing toward the street. "Saw one of 'em slip a note to Marshal Tate. Don't look like they're askin permission, they're given orders." His words sent a murmur through the room, but no one contradicted him. Cassian stepped to the window and peered out. The riders hadn't moved. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to set the town on edge. Boone's words echoed again in his head, "They're sniffin' for blood." If they were passing orders to Tate, then the law wasn't on his side. He was already outnumbered, and maybe outmatched. The question was no longer if trouble would strike, but when. By midday, smoke rose in the distance, faint but steady. Someone had set fire to a haystack out near the creek, the same place Clara said the strangers had been watching. Cassian rode hard to the spot, but by the time he arrived, the flames were dying, leaving nothing but blackened earth. He crouched low, scanning the ground. Hoof prints. More than a few. And carved into the bark of a nearby tree was a crude mark, an X slashed deep with a knife. A warning. Cassian felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted him to know they were close. As he mounted up, a chill spread through him despite the heat of the sun. Whatever these men wanted, it wasn't cattle, and it wasn't land. They were circling him like wolves, and wolves never circled without intent to strike. The first shot came at dusk. Cassian Holt was riding back toward his ranch when the crack of a rifle split the evening air. The bullet whistled past his shoulder, splintering the fence post ahead. His horse reared, muscles tense with panic, but Cassian held firm, eyes scanning the tree line. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, dusters trailing, their faces half hidden by brimmed hats. It wasn't an ambush meant to kill. If they wanted him dead, he'd already be on the ground. This was a warning, loud and clear. Cassian dismounted slowly, his revolver drawn but held low, the barrel glinting in the fading light. One of the riders, tall and broad with a scar slicing down his cheek, stepped forward. "Cassian Holt," he called, his voice gravelly. "You've been asking questions that don't belong to you. Best thing you can do is forget what you think you heard." The man's tone wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Cassian didn't answer. His silence was louder than words, and it drew a sneer from the rider's lips. From behind, another rider spoke up. "We ain't here for cattle. We ain't here for land. We're here for you. Walk away now, and maybe Greystone don't burn for your sins." The words sliced sharper than the scarred man's threat. Cassian's grip tightened on his Colt, though he kept the weapon pointed toward the ground. He was outnumbered, but surrender wasn't in his blood. He shifted his stance, boots grinding into the dirt, and finally broke the silence. "If you came all this way, you'd better say what you mean. 'Cause I don't scare easy." The scarred rider let out a harsh laugh. In a flash, steel gleamed as he drew his pistol and fired a deliberate shot that kicked up dust inches from Cassian's boot. It wasn't meant to kill, but to humiliate. A ripple of tension shot through the clearing. Cassian's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his revolver, quick as lightning, and fired back, shattering the brim of the man's hat clean off his head. Gasps echoed from the other riders, their horses stamping nervously at the sudden violence. For a heartbeat, the air froze. No one moved, no one breathed. Then, with a sharp whistle, the riders wheeled their horses and retreated into the trees, vanishing as swiftly as they'd appeared. Their message had been sent, but so had his. Cassian stood alone in the settling dust, chest rising and falling with the weight of what just passed. He hadn't won, but he hadn't lost either. This was no longer a quiet threat whispered in shadows, it was open war. As the night fell heavy, Cassian mounted his horse again. The path home felt longer, darker, and far less certain. He knew they would be back, and next time, they wouldn't be satisfied with warnings. The West didn't forgive defiance. It punished it with blood. The night after the standoff, Cassian Holt sat at his kitchen table, the lamplight flickering across his weathered face. His revolver rested nearby, freshly cleaned, as though he expected the riders to come crashing through his door any minute. He replayed the confrontation in his head, every threat and every glance, until the sound of boots crunching outside broke his thoughts. He stood, hand on the Colt, but when the door opened, it was Eleanor Hargrove. Her eyes were sharp, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. "They're not just after you," she said. "They're after what you carry." Cassian frowned, his voice low. "I don't carry nothing worth dying over." Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. "That's where you're wrong. You've got something tied to their leader, Silvan Roarke. He wasn't just some stranger wandering into Greystone. He used to ride with your brother." The words landed like a bullet. Cassian's jaw tightened. His brother, long dead, had been the reason Cassian left the outlaw trail behind. To hear his name now, tangled in this mess, reopened wounds he thought buried under years of silence. Eleanor pulled a folded paper from inside her shawl and laid it on the table. "This was slipped under my door 2 nights ago." Cassian unfolded it, scanning the words scrawled in a rough hand. It wasn't a threat, it was a claim. A claim that Cassian held knowledge of a hidden cache of money and weapons from his brother's old gang. His stomach turned. He had burned that past to ashes. But now those ashes had stirred, and men like Roarke were willing to kill to sift through them. The cabin felt smaller, the air heavier. Cassian's mind drifted back to nights on the trail with his brother, before greed and betrayal split them apart. He remembered the fire in his brother's eyes, the promises of riches, and the inevitable blood that followed. He had left it all behind for a chance at peace. Yet here it was, clawing its way back, threatening not only him but everyone in Greystone. "They think I know where it is," Cassian muttered, his voice bitter. Eleanor's silence told him she believed the same. A knock came again, this time heavier, urgent. Clara Boone burst through the door, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with fear. "They've taken my father," she cried. "Said it was the price for protecting you." Her words cracked in the dim light, filling the room with dread. Cassian felt the ground tilt beneath him. This wasn't just about his past anymore. Innocent lives were caught in the noose because of what these men believed he knew. Cassian stood, his decision heavy but clear. If they want the truth, they'll get it. But it won't be the one they're expecting. He holstered his revolver, the weight of his brother's ghost pressing down on him. For the first time in years, the outlaw inside him stirred awake. Trouble had come to Greystone, and it was time to meet it head-on. The following evening found Cassian Holt riding into the outskirts of Greystone with a fire in his chest and a storm in his head. Clara Boone's words echoed like a church bell, "They've taken my father." Every hoofbeat of his horse felt like a countdown. The town lay ahead, lanterns flickering in windows, streets quiet but tense, as though the earth itself knew what was about to unfold. Cassian had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival, it was about who would pay the price for his past. He tied his horse behind the blacksmith's shop and slipped through the shadows toward the saloon. That's where they would be. Men like Roarke always gravitated to whiskey and spectacle. Sure enough, through the cracked window he saw them, 3 of the riders, laughing too loud, their boots propped on tables. And in the corner, bound to a chair, was Jedediah Boone. The old rancher's face was swollen, his lip bleeding, but his eyes still carried defiance. Cassian's blood boiled, but he forced himself still. One wrong move, and Boone's life would end before he could lift his gun. Cassian crouched low, watching. He needed a plan, but options were thin. He was one man against a room full of killers. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, thumb grazing the worn grip. For the first time in years, he felt the old doubt claw at him. What if I can't pull this off? He could vanish tonight, leave Greystone behind, and no one would stop him. But the thought curdled in his gut. Running would make him no better than his brother, the man who'd built this curse in the first place. Suddenly, the saloon doors swung open. Marshal Vernon Tate stepped inside, his badge catching the lamplight. For a moment, Cassian felt hope, maybe the law would finally do its job. But then Tate tipped his hat toward the riders and joined their table, laughter mixing with theirs. Any illusion of justice crumbled. Tate wasn't here to stop them. He was part of it. Cassian's stomach sank, the risk growing higher. He wasn't just up against Roarke's men, the law itself had turned against him. Inside, Boone caught sight of Cassian through the window. Their eyes locked. The rancher gave a subtle shake of his head, as if to say, "Don't do it. Save yourself." But Cassian couldn't. He owed Boone more than silence. He owed Greystone more than fear. If he backed down now, the whole town would be left at the mercy of wolves. Cassian slipped back into the shadows, mind racing. He couldn't walk through the front door, guns blazing. But he could use the cover of night, the narrow alleys, the forgotten back doors. It was a desperate plan, stitched together with little more than nerve. But in the west, Sometimes nerve was the only weapon a man had left. And tonight, Cassian was willing to risk everything, even his own life, to take the fight straight to Roarke's men. The back alley behind the saloon reeked of spilled whiskey and gunpowder. Cassian Holt pressed against the wall, his breath steady, his revolver cocked. Through the cracked door he could see Jedediah Boone tied in the corner, the riders circling him like vultures. Then a new set of footsteps echoed across the wooden floorboards, calm, deliberate, commanding. Silvan Roarke stepped inside, his presence heavier than any gun in the room. The men straightened as if their spines were pulled by wire. This was no hired hand, this was the leader. Roarke's face carried years of dust and blood, his eyes as cold as the steel revolver at his hip. "Cassian Holt," he drawled, though Cassian hadn't revealed himself. "I know you're lurking nearby. You always did have a taste for dramatics. Come on out. Let's finish what your brother started." His words froze Cassian in place. The past roared back like thunder, the nights on the outlaw trail, the arguments, the betrayal. Roarke hadn't just known his brother. He had ridden beside him, bled beside him, and perhaps betrayed him too. Cassian pushed the door open and stepped inside, revolver raised. The room tensed, every man's hand inching toward a holster. Boone lifted his head, relief flashing in his swollen eyes. Cassian's voice was low, sharp as a blade. "You want me? You've got me. But let the old man walk." Roarke smiled, slow and cruel. "Always the noble fool. Your brother said the same once right before the vultures picked him clean." The words cut deeper than a bullet. For the first time, Cassian saw the truth. Roarke hadn't just been his brother's ally. He had been the one who betrayed him. The revelation churned the room. Some of the riders exchanged glances, uneasy. Betrayal was poison among men who lived by loyalty, and Roarke's smirk carried the weight of confession. Cassian seized the moment. "You follow a man who'd sell his own kin. How long before he does the same to you?" The words struck like gunfire, and doubt spread across their faces. One rider lowered his pistol, eyes shifting nervously toward the door. Roarke drew his revolver in a flash, but Cassian was faster. Their guns roared at once, smoke filling the room, glass shattering, men diving for cover. Boone toppled with his chair, grunting as the ropes bit into his wrists. Cassian's bullet grazed Roarke's shoulder, spinning him back. Roarke's shot missed, but buried itself inches from Boone's head. Chaos erupted, boots stomping, chairs splintering, shouts rising above the haze. Then came the twist Cassian hadn't seen coming. From the doorway, Eleanor Hargrove stepped into the smoke, her shawl falling away to reveal a rifle steady in her grip. Her voice rang out clear as church bells, "Enough. This ends tonight." And for the first time, Roarke's smirk faltered. The saloon was a storm of gun smoke and shattered glass. Men scrambled for cover, but all eyes fixed on Eleanor Hargrove standing in the doorway, her rifle steady. Her presence cut through the chaos like a blade, silencing even the loudest shouts. Cassian Holt, revolver still in hand, used the moment to free Jedediah Boone, snapping the ropes from his wrists. Boone groaned, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "I can still stand," he muttered, pulling himself upright. Silvan Roarke wiped blood from his shoulder, his smirk returning despite the pain. "Always the hero, Cassian," he sneered. "But you're just one man. And one man can't stand against the tide." He gestured toward his riders, but hesitation lingered in their faces. Cassian's words about loyalty still gnawed at them. Betrayal was the one sin even outlaws couldn't abide, and now they saw their leader for what he was. The silence from his men was louder than any bullet. Cassian stepped forward, voice hard as iron. "Your war isn't with Greystone. It isn't with Boone. It's with me, and it ends now." His revolver stayed leveled at Roarke, but his eyes swept the room, daring the riders to move. One by one, hands drifted away from holsters. Even Reuben Pike, trembling near the bar, shook his head and muttered, "Ain't worth dying for him." The spell Roarke held was breaking. With a snarl, Roarke lunged, his revolver flashing. Cassian's shot cracked almost in the same breath, the two gunmen colliding in a violent exchange that shook the room. Roarke staggered back, clutching his chest, his revolver slipping from his hand. He collapsed against the table, the whiskey glasses shattering around him, his final laugh bitter and hollow. "Just like your brother, you'll die fightin' ghosts." Then his eyes went still, the smirk fading with his last breath. The room exhaled as if the town itself had been holding its lungs tight. The riders, shaken and leaderless, holstered their weapons and slipped out into the night, their loyalty gone with Roarke's last breath. Boone clapped a hand to Cassian's shoulder, his voice hoarse. "You saved me, and you saved Greystone." Cassian said nothing, his eyes fixed on Roarke's lifeless body. Victory always came with scars, and this one cut deep. Eleanor lowered her rifle, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "It's over," she said, but her gaze lingered on Cassian. They both knew it wasn't truly over, not in the West. Peace was fragile, and ghosts had long shadows. Yet for this night, Greystone could breathe again. Cassian holstered his Colt, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. He had faced the storm, and for now, the town still stood. Weeks passed since the night Greystone nearly tore itself apart. The saloon had been repaired, its windows replaced, though the bullet holes in the walls remained as silent reminders of the battle. Life slowly returned to the town, children laughing in the dusty streets, merchants calling out their wares, the church bell ringing each Sunday morning. Yet beneath it all lingered the memory of Silvan Roarke and the shadows he had cast. Some wounds would never vanish, though time had a way of dulling their edge. Cassian Holt spent most days back on his ranch, mending fences, driving cattle, and trying to lose himself in the rhythm of the land. But the peace he'd once known carried a different weight now. Boone often rode out to visit, his daughter Clara at his side, bringing bread or news from town. Their presence was a quiet reminder that Cassian wasn't alone, no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise. Boone would slap his back and laugh, though his voice still carried the rasp of the night he nearly lost his life. Eleanor Hargrove became something of a legend herself. Folks whispered about the widow who walked into a storm of bullets with a rifle steady in her hands. Some claimed she was blessed, others called her reckless, but everyone respected her. She and Cassian shared few words after that night, but when their eyes met across the town square, there was an unspoken bond born of survival, tempered in fire. Marshal Vernon Tate resigned soon after Roarke's fall. Too many had seen his betrayal, too many had heard the whispers. He left Greystone under the cover of dawn, his badge left hanging on the door of the sheriff's office. For a while, law in Greystone came not from a star-shaped piece of tin, but from the townsfolk themselves, neighbors watching out for neighbors, bound by the memory of what they'd nearly lost. One evening, Cassian rode out to the edge of town where the plains stretched endless under the setting sun. He dismounted, pulling from his saddlebag a small, weathered photograph of his brother, creased and faded, the last remnant of a man swallowed by greed. He stood there in silence, the wind tugging at his coat. "You left me with this fight," he muttered. "But I reckon I ended it my way." He buried the photograph beneath a cairn of stones, marking the grave of a past he no longer carried. As night fell, Cassian mounted his horse and turned back toward Greystone. Behind him lay ghosts and betrayal, ahead, the faint light of lanterns flickering in the town he'd fought to save. The West wasn't a land of peace, it was a land of choices. And sometimes, the fastest draw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first.